thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Yeah, might be overstating things, but thank you anyway. Okay, so yeah, firstly, thank you to ACF for inviting me here to talk today, and also for collaborating and working on this project over the last sort of year and a half, really. Took us quite a long time to get there, but we started off asking some rather simple questions. What do people spend on nutrition? How much might need to be spent on nutrition? These proved fiendishly difficult to answer, as you'll see in the study outside. So, although it took quite a long time, I think we made a little bit of progress. Okay, secondly, I'd like to say that I'm not a nutrition expert. Everyone in this room knows more about nutrition than I do, no doubt. I'm a finance person primarily, but over the last year and a half I've learned quite a bit about nutrition, but I'm sure that you all know more about it than I do. So apologies for any mistakes at the outset. Okay, so this is what we're some questions, 4 questions I'm going to try and address today. Firstly, why should we finance nutrition? Now, I'm very much sort of preaching to the converted here. You know why we should finance nutrition, or you wouldn't be here. But we'll just, as a little placeholder, we'll recap on that. Secondly, how much will this cost, roughly speaking? Thirdly, who should meet these costs? And finally, where might they get this money from? Quite simple questions, but rather profound implications. Okay, so why should we finance nutrition? Now, as I say, you're all very familiar with this, but it's probably no harm just to recap what it was that brought you to this room in the first place. You know, as you see, the undernutrition is responsible for large numbers, millions of deaths a year. The effects are irreversible, both individually and at the country level. You see people's life chances severely impaired when they've been undernourished as a child. That cumulatively has a large drag on economic growth in developing countries. And estimated cost 20 to 30 billion a year. Now that's a pretty rough estimate from 10 years ago. Probably quite grossly underestimates the true figure, but it's a very large number. Remember that number, the 20, 30 billion a year, the cost of undernutrition, and then compare that to the cost of dealing with the issue a bit later on. We'll get to that. Okay, and now you may or may not disagree, you may not agree with this, but unusually we know what works, broadly. Well, we know some of the things that work. Now I'm sure people who spend all their time working on nutrition might dispute that, in that there's lots of areas where, particularly in indirect nutrition effects and interactions and so on, program level, implementation, there's loads of things we don't know precisely, but coming from a non-nutrition background and having worked in other aspects of development, we know far more about how to deal with these issues than we do in other areas of development. Yeah? And I think it's important to remember that. It's also an excellent investment. I'm sure you're familiar with the Copenhagen consensus work. Just if you look at the benefit to cost ratio of investing in some direct nutrition interventions, they're very large. 1 to 15 at a minimum level, going up to 1 to 138. You don't get cost-benefit ratios like that. I mean, hardly ever. It's a bit of a no-brainer in that sense. And then of the top interventions, when you're looking at impact and value for money, that the Copenhagen consensus came up with, nutrition is handled for 2, including the first one, the top one. So finally on that, whilst we don't know everything, we know enough to start, or as I've said there, well, too much not to start, really. When we first launched the report at the APPG group in Parliament, I made this point then that, and just to reiterate it, whilst it's important to continue to research best practice and how we deliver that, I don't think that really shouldn't be a bar to getting on with implementing what we do know. And raising a large amount of cash is pretty much fundamental to that. So okay, how much will this cost? Now, what I've focused on here and in the report is the cost of direct interventions. And there's lots of caveats in the report. That's not to suggest that indirect interventions are considered unimportant, or that the enabling environment, or that the more holistic approach to nutrition is not I'm considering that to be unimportant at all. Just that the focus was initially on direct interventions, and I think that's worth a study in its own right. But as I say, that in no way takes away from the importance of other issues such as inequality and so on. Yeah? The best estimates we have come from the World Bank in 2010. This is Sue Horton's study, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar with. with so estimated annual cost 10.6 billion for the interventions, 1.2 billion for capacity building, research, and M&E, adding up to shortly a little under 12 billion US dollars. Three categories of intervention up on the screen there. So social and behaviour change and communication. That accounts for 27% of those total costs. Micronutrients and deworming is 15%. Complementary and therapeutic feeding is the largest component at about 58% of that. Now that study looked at not only the 36 high burden countries, but also 32 additional smaller countries where undernutrition is a very high prevalence in the population. Okay, so these are the best estimates we have, not perfect, but they're the best we have. They've been endorsed by the Sun Movement. You're all familiar with that, so I don't need to give you any background there. And just to reiterate again at the end, within the Sun framework, direct interventions are only just one part of the whole package, which also includes, it's very much direct and indirect in a holistic approach. Okay, so this was our starting point really. This study came from 2010, using data a bit older than that. So the first thing I did was try and update, not really update, but sort of forecast what would happen to the total costs of these interventions if nothing happened, or if no additional funding was raised. So this table shows two things really. Forget about the far right column for now. The first three columns of numbers are estimates for 2010, 2015 and 2020. They're based on estimates of changes in stunting over that period within these UN regions. Again, taking into account that changes in stunting don't necessarily correlate directly with changes in other aspects of undernutrition, but they're the best estimates we had, so caveats and caveats, but we decided to go with that. The important thing, the main thing to show here is that we see not much of a change in the total level at the bottom in terms of total funding. This is just the 36 countries, by the way, which is why it's slightly lower than the UN figures, also the World Bank figures. You see a slight decline, but it's only marginal. More importantly is the differences between the regions, and we'll get to that on the next slide. The final column there is 2025 estimate from a study that Save the Children did, again based on stunting, but they just did 2-point estimates of 2010, 2025, and there you see a slightly larger decline. Now those falls, or the changes in global figures, are largely driven by global growth assumptions in a lot of these underlying models. Yeah? I'll get on to this. There might be some problems with that. This is an interesting slide from the study. So here you see that of the total decline, the very small decline in total cost is entirely driven by changes in Southeast and South Central Asia. Yeah, all the other regions see an increase in cost, and often quite a big increase, so approaching 20% in Central and Eastern Africa, right, for example. So, to summarise on that, while we see a small decline, there's major regional differences. In particular, except those two Asian regions, every other region would see, this is absent any major intervention or increase in or scaling up of interventions, would see an increase in the problem and a significant increase in some areas. I also think that those estimates might well understate the real effects for three reasons, which I give here. First, they're driven by stunting estimates, and these are likely to fall more than other aspects of undernutrition, such as wasting. Secondly, the relationship between growth and undernutrition isn't clear. So some of the assumptions that drive those models, how growth will positively affect undernutrition, are slightly optimistic, arguably. And thirdly, the growth estimates themselves may well be too optimistic. So just going back, if you look at the bottom there, so they're from Dionis et al. 2012, but based on figures from sort of 2010. You see here the big change is driven by growth, particularly in South Central Asia, particularly India. Growth estimates of India now are nowhere near as positive as they were in 2010. So that even on each of those figures, as I say, the picture may be more positive than the reality will turn out to be, and the picture's not that positive anyway. So, okay. So where does that leave us? So global costs around 10 billion a year, roughly. Current estimates of what's being spent from the first Aid for Nutrition report, somewhere between 100 and 400 million. So whichever way you cut it, there's a very large increase in funding needed. Okay, so who should meet the costs? The first question we looked at is the split between domestic and external funding. So of that 10 billion, how much should be met by domestic governments and how much by external sources, i.e. donors? Yeah. And again, this seemed, I was asking, this seemed like there must be some system. And eventually I got to an answer that the rule of thumb is generally has been that donors pay for materials costs and domestic governments pay for labour and for implementation costs. That seems perfectly reasonable in many ways. So I started to explore that a little. What are the implications of that? That's relevant because the different interventions, the 13 direct interventions, have very different ratios in terms of labour and material costs. So for example, 90% of the costs of community-based interventions are labour, whereas for iron fortification that's only 5%. For MAM it's 12% and SAM 70%. So although you could quibble over some of those estimates, they're from the World Bank study, but also that the consequence of that is that countries with different compositions of interventions would have very different implied domestic contributions. In particular, because of the high labour costs in SAM, because it's community-based management, countries with higher incidence of SAM would end up, under that system, that rule of thumb, with the highest domestic contributions. It also, unsurprisingly, transpires that those countries are also the poorest countries. So when you ran through the numbers of this, you found a negative correlation with per capita income and implied domestic contributions, which basically means that the poorest countries, relatively speaking, would be required to pay the largest amount of money. So that struck me as a bit of a problem, potentially, and an unintended consequence. I don't think that's particularly deliberate. So in the report we make a number of suggestions of how you could overcome that. Perhaps, one example would be that donors also covered the community-based costs, the labour costs of SAM as well as the materials cost, and that would overcome that quite considerably, really. But there's lots of other ways you could do it. The most important thing is to be aware, to think through those consequences in terms of implementation, and what they're going to mean in terms of the domestic external split, and for that to be fair and transparent. What you don't want to have is an ad hoc system where different countries end up with different outcomes, and without meaning it to be the case, the poorest countries get the worst outcomes. So the purpose of this was very much to highlight the need to think through clearly the implications of these decisions. Okay, so that brings us to external financing options. When you start off with the 10 billion there, and what we did in the report was assume that we'd overcome the problem here with SAM by having donors meet the labour costs of that intervention as well. That ends up with external funding needs being about just less than 6 billion of that 10. And we came up with two broad options of how you could meet that. The first is very straightforward, really, the fair shares model. And under this, additional costs were met by current donors and multilaterals and private foundations. The donor contribution is relative to GDP. Over the next, between now and 2020, forecast GDP, looked at relative changes and then allocated the resource needs between them. For multilaterals, we kept the same donor, bilateral, multilateral split and did the same process. And private foundations, it's finger in the air, really. So we looked at what's currently being spent and assumed that you had a little bit on that, and maybe that would be the maximum, or maybe it would and maybe it wouldn't. But despite sort of some considerable inquiries, actually, it wasn't easy to get any more information than that. And it's quite difficult to be planning a long-term process on the basis of voluntary contributions if you don't know what they're going to be. So we ended up assuming that they'd be broadly what they are now. There wasn't really much. There wasn't the basis for any other decision, really. Okay, so that's that. Now, in terms of the additional donor funding, it's significant, but not vast. So for the UK, for example, it was about an additional 250 million a year-ish, which is a big number. but it's not that big in terms of if it's total budget. I mean, it's less than 1%. And in terms of the general size of the economy and so on, it's not that big at all. So options which we set out in the report are to reallocate existing ODA funds, problematic to some extent, raise additional funds. And here we have a box in the study which gives some options for innovative sources of funding that donors could use in order to raise the additional funds. And you'll see the three groupings at the bottom there. I'll get onto that in a minute. What we tried to do is think about what might be appropriate. So, for example, a fat tax, as was introduced in Denmark, seemed a pretty appropriate way of funding additional spending on nutrition, for argument's sake. Bilaterally, we could see greater debt relief by donor countries, with high-burden countries freeing up more domestic resources for them. There's a number of different options that could be tried. Now, we looked at the report focused on, or the estimates just looked at current donors, the traditional donors, but that could obviously be readily extended to new donors and readily extended to greater contribution from private foundations. I was a little skeptical of private sector contributions as opposed to private foundation contributions, because the private sector is only going to contribute things on a reciprocal basis, if you mean. So private foundations are giving grants, they're trying to get an impact from that, but they're not expecting a return. A private corporation is a different beast, really, in that if it's putting money into something, it's doing it to get some money out. Now, there may well be, and there certainly would be, scope for additional engagement in terms of specialised foods and the private sector being involved in that. But that's a different matter. That's more of a market transaction, really, to some extent. So, whilst, I mean, people often talk about more private sector money because they have a lot of money, but that doesn't mean that it's going to hand it over for nothing. So, and I think that it's important to bear that in mind. On private foundations, the more the better, definitely, because that's not reciprocal money, but it needs to be stable, it needs to be long term. And so you need to know that if this amount of money is going in this year, the same amount of money is going to go next year. Otherwise, planning, longer term, medium, long term planning is kind of impossible, really. So that's why we made broadly conservative estimates for that. Okay, so that was option one, which it would be the simplest option, and yeah, whether it's fair or not is a matter of debate, but it's certainly the simplest option. Now, we also recognise that pushing for more public spending and increased taxes in the current environment isn't that popular and might not be that politically realistic. So I was asked to explore some innovative finance options. So if the money available from donors, either new or traditional or both, is limited and isn't going to increase, where might we look to raise this amount of money? But bear in mind we were looking there at, so we're looking at 5.9 billion. That's quite a lot of money, but again, it's not a vast amount of money in the grand scheme of things. In my introduction, the question was asked whether there's enough resources. There's certainly enough resources around to fund that. It's just whether or not we can get hold of them is the question. But there's no lack of resources. So, okay, innovative finance options. I organised these into 3 different forms, anyway, I'll just go through them. So the first of these is guarantees, or you could broadly group under the category of guarantees. Now this is where donors or official agencies put in place mechanisms to influence the behaviour of the private sector. And they basically do that by guaranteeing a future revenue stream. So an example of that is the advanced market commitment in pharmaceuticals. So donors want to see vaccines and whatever developed in a certain area. They'll say, if you do lots of research and development on this, we'll guarantee that we'll buy the product for you in the future. And that gives the private sector certainty to make that, do that research, make that investment, develop the products. A similar mechanism might be applicable in nutrition, but with respect to very specialised interventions on the therapeutic and complementary feeding front, primarily, I'd say, and food fortification. But I mean, you guys would know much more about that than me, but it struck me that where we need a large increase in the availability of particular products, and we know what they are, that's a mechanism that could be made use of. Yeah? Now, another form of guarantee, which is very different, but it works in a similar way, are special purpose bonds. So we see recently there's been a lot of green bonds, but historically the IFIM, International Finance Facility for Immunisation, is the most famous example of this, where the government raises money in capital markets, invests it in immunisation, and then guarantees by issuing a bond, and then donors pay the interest rate on that bond over a specified period, 10 or 20 years. Now, an important point to bear in mind about this is it's not new money, it's not additional money. So donors, it's a front loading of money and a front loading of commitment. So if donors are going to pay for this anyway, they're just spreading it out over a longer period of time by borrowing it. Yeah? But they also have to pay a return on the bond to the institution, to the investors which raise the money. So there are only certain circumstances where that's a good idea. And I think the nutrition might well be one of them, actually. So it's a good idea where it's pretty clear what the solution will. Where people are pretty clear they know what works. Investing up front at large scale will yield very serious long-term benefits and reduce future costs. So there's a good argument for actually all the money that would have been spent over 10 years, front-loading a lot of that and putting it in early. So with immunisation, vaccination, that makes sense. Nutrition, given the 1,000 days issue, is a similar case to some extent. But as I say, it's important to bear in mind, it's not new money, it's a reorganisation of existing funds. The second area was market-based mechanisms, which essentially means taxes. And I called them market-based mechanisms because people don't like to talk about taxes. Well, you may not like to talk about taxes, but politicians don't like to talk about taxes. So you describe it in a technical sounding way. Levies is the other one, but it also means taxes. So what's distinct from the first option? So I talked about fat taxes and so on there. Those are national level taxes that could help donors raise new ODA funds. Yeah? Here I'm talking about supranational, so above the national level. So this is like new forms of taxes. An example would be a levy on shipping being outside national jurisdictions. Another FTTC, so that's financial transaction taxes or currency transaction taxes. And you can organise those, particularly on the currency side, so that the important point is they don't go through national budgets. You need to establish new institutions at the supranational level or link in with, say, UN bodies. But I think there's a very strong case to be made for such mechanisms, even if we have enough money to fund this, because then you're establishing a precedent of global institutions to fund global public goods, arguably, which is lots of people have been arguing with this for an awful long time, and it would be good to add some weight to that, really. So currency transaction taxes would be a very good way of doing that. Obviously, all these things raise large amounts of money. I did some estimates on a currency tax, global currency tax, and they were about $30 or $40 billion a year at a 0.005% rate, which is a very low rate, which would fund this, how many times? Lots of times, 6 times. So that's an option. And something we suggested, which, again, a bit like the fat tax, was very much tailored to this issue, was a tax on food commodity speculation. So over the last 10 years particularly, we've seen a vast increase in financial investment and speculation in food commodity futures markets. Yeah? There's lots of dispute about the influence that has had on the price of food and the volatility of that price. But there's a very strong correlation between the flow of funds that's gone into those sectors and movements in prices that have resulted. Yeah? The causality is very difficult and it's very disputed. But anyway, it struck me that were one to tax food commodities, you could both raise significant funds and potentially, if it was well designed, potentially reduce the volatility of food price movement at the same time, which might be quite a nice symmetry, if you like. I'm a bit obsessed with symmetry for some reason. The third are revenue reclaim mechanisms, which are arguably the most, I'd say, the 2 and 3 are probably the most important. Just to say back on 2, that is new money, and large amounts of potentially new money, yeah? Number 3, this is basically putting in place mechanisms that increase the resources that are available to developing countries themselves. The issue, the one I raise here is tax evasion. I'm not sure if it's in the report, but if any of you have seen the figures on tax evasion from developing countries, they far exceed global ODA flows in terms of the estimates. Even a small proportion of that would have a very significant effect. As well as raising funds for developing countries themselves to spend, of course, you get lots of other positive things in terms of policy autonomy and so on. You're increasing the domestic tax base, so not just for nutrition but more generally, social contract issues and all that. So that potentially has very positive wider effects as well as raising money. Now, what are the obstacles to that? Well, they're the same old obstacles really. So need for international cooperation. So whilst guarantees are bilateral, individual donors could do that, yeah? Market-based mechanisms, that's more difficult. Now, you could introduce a currency, any country could introduce a financial transaction tax or a currency transaction tax. A global version would be a lot better for lots of reasons, but it also raise a lot more money. And the same on food commodity speculation. So you couldn't, it'd be very difficult for an individual country to implement that. You'd need some kind of global agreement. It hasn't proven that easy to get global agreement on international taxes, but that doesn't mean they're not a good idea, and doesn't mean that the push shouldn't continue. On revenue reclaim mechanisms, I mean, I think that's probably more straightforward. There's been considerable progress in terms of getting international agreement, particularly at the EU level, to move on some of these issues. Transparency of tax being a really obvious one. There's been some stuff in the press recently in the UK about this. So what profits do different companies earn in different countries? If you don't know that, it's very difficult to know what tax they should pay. So just requiring companies to organise their accounts so that it makes it clear where the profits are earned will prevent them moving money from one jurisdiction to another, or make it less likely they'll be able to. So little things like that are doable, and so the European Union could require EU companies to do that, for argument's sake, and that would be a very important first step. As well as cooperation, a related point is opposition from vested interests. There may be a relationship between that and the lack of international cooperation, for argument's sake, but that's something that needs to be faced down, really. I mean, in nutrition, but more generally, if we're looking for large amounts of money to fund things that people think are important, whether it's in development or the environment, this requires new mechanisms. People talk about innovative finance an awful lot, but to date it hasn't raised that much money. And there's a bit of a sort of tweak in there and a little clever mechanism there. But we're talking, the potential here is vast, but only if politicians are able to overcome these obstacles and tax large things. So the financial sector, the shipping sector, these are big things, and a small tax on very big things raises a large amount of money. But I just did a paper for the next year's European Report on Development, looking at innovative finance in a post-2015, post-MDG framework, because people are very excited about that. But the excitement is only justified if you actually see something happen. And that's going to require a lot of political courage to some extent, and people to take the lead, but it's extremely important. And the other thing from a nutrition perspective, that if it happens, if these things do happen, you want to make sure that the nutrition lobby is firmly in before all the money goes off somewhere else. Because a lot of these innovative finance mechanisms, there's a number of, people would be very keen to have that as well. Okay, now I can't claim credit for this lovely chart, which Natasha, yes, did, and I was just complimenting her on the way, and it's fabulous. I'm rubbish at charts, but this is just, it entirely encapsulates what I was thinking of, really. So it's got sources of funding for nutrition at the top there, and there are four sources, really. So developing country governments, international aid, private companies, and wealthy people in developing countries. So I'd say all of those so developing country governments, obviously very important. I mean, I've kind of parked that there, and focused on the external funding today, but we're going to be starting working over the next year or two on resource mobilisation within developing countries. Not to say that's obviously very, very important, but it's a separate issue in my mind. But anyway, that's a big thing. International aid, we've kind of discussed. Private companies, as I say, I think is limited and should be approached not necessarily warily, just intelligently. So there's no problem getting private companies involved, but just be aware of what it is they're getting in exchange, and for that to be clear and transparent. Wealthy people in developing countries is important, but obviously limited, particularly in the sort of high burden groups and high risk groups that we're talking about, where wealthy people are few and far between. So whilst that's important in some areas, and that there are problems of undernutrition in the relatively wealthy, it's also limited more broadly. Private funds and foundations, I don't know. I mean, there's considerable potential there, but it's yet to be seen just how that works out. Okay, so that brings us down to the international community and donor country governments. So of these, I'd say the most important are developing country governments, the next tier down, the international community and donor country governments. That's sort of, I think that, if we're looking to plug this gap, that's where it's going to be plugged. And it's organised there along in those three channels that we discussed earlier, so guarantees, global market-based mechanism, and revenue reclaim mechanisms. Just to reiterate, of those, guarantees don't represent new money, but they're cleverer ways of packaging existing money. Market-based mechanisms are new money and very, very needed. And revenue reclaim mechanisms are not new money, but they are new money for developing countries. So the money's just being moved from where it shouldn't be to where it should be. You see what I mean? So that's kind of a bit of a no-brainer, really. Anyway, and so for both donor countries and for the international community, those are the three sort of areas that they could think about. And that's that.